So welcome, everybody. Good to have everybody here. Tonight, this should be a very interesting program because we've never really done anything, I don't think, in all the years about Detroit publishing postcards. And it's a big company. They published over 7 million postcards a year. Rosanne, take it away.
I want to thank you all for being here to learn more about Detroit Publishing Company. And I use this one postcard because to me, it's just gorgeous. And I don't know what you all think of it. But also when I was an intern at the Colorado Historical Society, the society runs the Georgetown Loop. And so I'd go up and there, not necessarily frequently, but a few times. It really does look like this. So Georgetown is west of Denver and south of Breckenridge, if you can imagine that. But you probably don't know where those are. And a little bit of background, Detroit Publishing Company, they made photochromes, which are also called Ock prints, the Faustin postcards, the Little Faustin Journeys, Life Publishing, Fred Harvey cards, and other contract postcards. I had on the announcement slide over 30,000 different postcards, and that's what I truly believe, but I changed it down from that because according to Nancy Stechschulte's book, there were between 17 and 19,500 postcards. And as I was working on this, I realizing that actually what gets it up to the 30,000 is how a lot of the cards would morph, the same number would morph to as the years went by. So, and we'll discuss that as I get into the different postcards. But they were primarily made between 1898 and 1923, and the company fully dissolved in 1932. So here are the two palettes that they used. So, and the white one has a copyright on it. The black one, it's just the name of the company. So the white one was says Photographic Company, and the black one is with the newer name of Publishing Company. And the name Detroit Photographic Company comes from, they bought a photographic company that did printing but it was primarily religious. So they later changed the name to Detroit Publishing so people wouldn't be confused with the photographic company. Here's their incorporation information, a picture of one of their factories. As they grew and changed, they changed locations as well. And second story would have been their offices, and then they were able to go out onto the other side of the building's roof and actually work out there as well. So here's a photograph of the Livingstone brothers, and I know that the one at the far left is William Livingstone, and he died in 1924. I've tried to find more information out about him and his brother Robert. Basically, they were the sons of a prominent banker in Detroit, where he has a statue, he has in town, he has other, he was renowned, we'll just say that. And then I don't know my way around this group because it wasn't that easy to circle. I didn't know the people, but this is William Henry Jackson in the center. Edwin Husher, and I don't know which person he is. He was the founder of the company. He was a photographer and he was plant manager, but he left the company fairly early. He left in 1902. And Husher was also who pulled in William Henry Jackson, and they went after Jackson primarily because Jackson had such a large portfolio of negatives. And on the right here is a photograph of a pocket watch that was given to Husher by the Photochrome company in Zurich. And so what is the Photochrome company, or the Photochrome Phosphotint process? And it's a secret lithographic process that doesn't use a screen, so you don't have all the little dots in it. It's created on stones, and they use as many stones as needed for the number of colors that they're using. And it was invented by the Photoglobe company in Zurich, Switzerland. And in addition to Detroit and the Photoglobe of Switzerland, there was also Photochrome Limited of England and an unnamed licensed company that had been in partnership with Photoglobe prior to Detroit and the English company. So here's a series of images, and my trusted lithographic or lithography advisor told me, okay, this is the first image, then magenta, yellow, cyan, and that this one that just has the colors pop versus number 4 would be adding black. And so that's the difference there. And this is the proof page, so you can see how much the colors change when they're proofed. So they had multiple, as I mentioned, they had multiple factory locations between 1895 and 1933. The longest was on the southwest corner of Vermont and Albuquerque avenues. And they also had retail stores in Detroit. Then I'm including their railroad cars as also being showrooms. And then, but they had individual postcard shops were available as well. They were sold at, and this one is labeled the smallest postcard shop. And this is a postcard rack. And actually, I have seen these over time on eBay. But they had a showroom in New York on Lexington at 34th, and stores in Boston, Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco. And I may have omitted and in LA. And I say the company card being the California special, because it really did make it easy for members of the company to travel around. And the California special was pretty much Jackson's private train car. And here he parked it at the Hotel del Coronado on Coronado Island. And he spent a year in San Diego working out of the California special. And he met clients and people there to discuss business. So who was William Henry Jackson? Well, he was born near you guys in Neesville, New York in 1843. He died in New York City in 1942, which made him 99 years old at his death. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And to me, he really does deserve to be buried there, because he was an American hero. He was an artist. His mother was an artist, and she trained him as an artist, but he was an artist primarily rather than a photographer before and during his enlistment in the Civil War. And during the war, he never met nor saw Matthew Brady or any of his assistants. But instead, during the war, he became known for his skill as an artist and did portraits of the other men in his regiment. His unit, commander, Colonel Blunt, learned of his artistic skill and assigned him to illustrate military life. As a volunteer, he had only a 9-month enlistment and left the military after they were up. And both before and after the Civil War, Jackson was a photographic retoucher, And I think his skills as an artist made him a good retoucher. He later, after the Civil War, he had an argument with his fiancée and didn't properly know how to deal with it. And so he just took off and fled, ran into a couple former soldiers from his unit, and they kind of ran off. The three of them ran off and headed west. And so they became, they worked together on finding ways to make money. And they ended up as bullwhackers, driving wagon trains groups west. The people on the wagon trains were mainly Mormons heading to Utah. He ended up settling, after that, he ended up working again for a photographic studio. And it was during those years that he became a photographer. And he later bought the studio he worked at in Omaha. And I have that picture there because it was of Jackson Brothers photographers in Omaha. And his father told him that if he had two of his brothers work with him, that he'd pay for the studio to buy it. He was then known, after he started working as a photographer, because he took off and left the business to his brothers. He was known for his photographs of the West and primarily of Colorado and Wyoming. And he was the first person to photograph Yellowstone and Mesa Verde, and also the Mount of the Holy Cross. And I'll show you that picture later. Hayden and Jackson and other members of the Hayden expedition helped create Yellowstone as the first national park. And Jackson's photographs, probably more than Mesa Verde ones, as well as Yosemite and Yellowstone, helped to establish the Antiquities Act of 1906. And then he joined the Detroit Publishing Company in 1897, and he left in 1924. So the Hayden expedition, Hayden was a geographer, and so they were different people, different skill sets of all the members of the team. Jackson was the photographer. There was a painter. There was a meteorologist. There was a geologist. There was an agriculturist and a mineralogist. So there were a lot of different skills. And then there were also support people like Val the cook, just assistants to these people to help them through. This is Ferdinand Hayden here. And in this picture, he's at the center with Jackson on his left. These images are from the Scottsbluff National Monument and Museum, and that's now part of the National Park Service. And I'm going to make a confession. When I lived in Denver for work, I went to Scottsbluff like every other month, and I never once stopped in that museum. And I feel bad now because I think I would have enjoyed it. I was just typically in a rush because I'd see so many accounts in one day, and I just never took the time. So the Great Divide, and I'm sorry if you think that I am coming up with dorky titles to these slides. Clarence Jackson, who was Jackson's son, wanted the Western negatives housed in Denver at the Colorado Historical Museum. The whole collection, including papers, the watch that you saw earlier and all that, had been donated to the Henry Ford Museum by the Detroit Publishing Company, which made sense because the Henry Ford's in Detroit. He convinced them to send the collection to Colorado, but the Colorado Historical Museum didn't understand the importance of postcards and the photochrome lithographs, so they kept only the glass plate negatives of the West and sent everything else to the Library of Congress. But unfortunately, the attribution book went missing, and it wasn't discovered again until 1980, when someone was clearing out the Colorado Supreme Court library. And so before then, everything was attributed to William Henry Jackson. I started my work on my master's thesis in 1980. So I was the first person to use the attributions. So the missing attribution book also affected the Library of Congress's portion of the collection because it covered all of the items in the collection. The collection was called the William Henry Jackson Glass Negative Collection because they just assumed it was all Jackson's. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Zippy the Pinhead. His artist was Jackson's great-grandson and Clarence's grandson, William Henry Jackson Griffith. And Bill Griffith is Griffey in the comic strip, and it was Bill Griffith who coined the term, "Are we having fun yet?" which back in the 70s, I think was kind of overused. It's just something, and when I did speak with Bill Griffith about 10 years ago, and he was ever so proud of being William Henry Jackson's great-grandson. When I asked him a question and he said, "Well, I'm William Henry Jackson Griffith," to kind of prove it. He did inherit his great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother's artistic skills, but he also, he's now in his 80s, at some point in his 80s. And so I think he inherited Jackson's longevity, and he also he looks quite a bit like the pictures of Jackson as he got older. This is where I'll show you the attribution list. Why don't the numbers match? And basically, as you see, it's all the same image, but there are 3 different numbers. So this one here, 53064, is of the photochrome Ock print. It says Cathedral Rock near San Diego, California. The postcard is 6118 Cathedral Rock, La Jolla, California. It also on here has the little palette. Then the negative here, well, it looks like a black and white, is 11107 8x10 glass plate negative. If we go here to this attribution list, 11107 William Henry Jackson, La Jolla, Cathedral Rock. When I did my thesis, I also put in all these numbers by number. So you see Riverside, San Diego, La Jolla, Coronado, on down. And again, they're not like every single one of Riverside or every single one of Santa Monica. They're in numeric order in terms of the listing. And so this here is an abbreviation of the photographers' names to get them down to fit to 3 letters. Some of these I'm not familiar with, but they could have been in the eastern half of the country. Fitch, I know, was a local San Diego photographer, and they bought images from him, and I believe Lamson as well. And House, I think, just are the unknown or unattributed numbers. And here's Robert Livingstone, and that was later. And I don't see William Livingstone on here, but that would be my mistake if I skipped it. And they also were noted for being able to make modifications to the image. So on this side, you can see New Herald Office, and on this side, Souvenir Postcards, Detroit Publishing Company. And so they were able to make changes. And here on this one, and these are both from the Henry Ford Museum. This one, the little girl here, or small child here, is way out of the range of what should be the postcard. So they moved her in with the 2 other children. And now we're going to run through the different series of cards. And this one here, I was going through my cards and I noticed it has no number on it. And the F series were 1898, the G series 1899, and you can see what it is. And they are noted for having this private mailing card set up like this. And this is from the customs house in Tijuana, Mexico. And so on the postmark here, there's no year, just the day and the time. And then it was stamped again in Pasadena, again, no year. So I couldn't place it that way. But the 1000 series is noted for having typically vignettes. Sometimes there'd be 2 or 3 images on a front. And if you were here for my bathhouse talk, this is the Sutro baths that we saw the interior of. The 5000 series is, again, pretty much the same images that were in the 1000 series, just with a 5 added. And they were, so if you had a 151, for example, and added the 5 to the front, then it would be 5151. This one here has 2 images. This one here, and this is where I was saying, I do think that rather than just going by number, which Nancy had done in her book, that you could get up to many, many more when you change how the different versions of them over time, because the 5000 series, I mean, that was over 7 years, 1901 through 1907. There were a lot of changes in the cards over those years. And so you'd see like one that started out very small so that people could write on the front side of it, to say this one here that pretty much fills the whole card. There's just a little bit of room at the bottom. Or this one here, again, just a little bit of room at the bottom. There are, if you count those and how they vary over the years, then there easily could be 30,000 different postcards. And then the 6000 series came out during the same time as the 5000s, and they were full size, but with a narrow white borders. This is when, if you look here, they had a border on top, a border here. This one here has the narrow white border. This one here, if you can see it, because the color's about the same color as the background. Again, the narrow white border. And the 7000 series came out immediately after that. They were narrower. So instead of being 3.5, they were 3.25. And I'm going to share, like, what's this horse or animal doing on the car? And I asked about that, and someone pointed out, well, it's because the horse takes it uphill, and then when they're traveling downhill, they put him on the car, and he rides. Then the 8000 series, they went back to being 3.5 by 5.5, and they started using Detroit Publishing Company and the small logo palette. And again, here's the Sutro Baths. Then the 9000 series, same time period, but using red ink on the cards, and with the exception of the Ark House, which is in blue ink. And then I want to share something with you about this. This is the Ship Hotel Cabrillo. I had 2 of these, and one had glitter on it, which was popular, as you all probably know, at the turn of the century, until the postal workers started getting sick from the toxins in the glitter. And glitter is no longer made with those same chemicals. So if your little children or grandchildren play with glitter, now you know not to worry too much. Then the 10,000 series were also made during that same time period. And 2 differences: divided backs and inscribed with Fostent card made only by Detroit Publishing Company. So these are the first. Now, if you have an earlier card that they just kept producing over time, those probably also have those same features. They're not, the originals weren't made with those. So then the 11,000 series came in, and those, if they list a copyright date, it's probably earlier. Like on the white palette, there's a copyright. And so if this one was really, well, it says it's 1907, 1908, but if it was, it could have been copywritten in 1902. And so that's one of the things about that. 12,000 series, they used Foston on all the cards and no longer used any of the palette, either of the palettes. 13,000 series, same as the 12s for the information on them. But the 14,000 series is where there's differences. This one, primarily black and white, and it included Life Publishing, Harper and Brothers, or Harper Brothers as it was later known as, Collier and Son, Charles Dana Gibson and the Gibson Girls, and they were black and white, often humorous as well. And this was a book by the Life Publishing Company, James Montgomery Flagg. There was about 99 of them, so around 100 that were just regular Foston cards. And then we're skipping ahead. I'm not skipping ahead, but the numbers skip ahead to the 50,000 series. Why did they jump from 14 to 50? That's a difference of 36,000. It's probably because those numbers were used by either the English company or the Swiss company. So they skipped 250,000 for the photochromes and photochrome oct prints, the postcards. The lithographs these here are 3.5 by 7, and they're as large as 17 by 21. And if they're mounted, mine are not mounted. The mounting back says, "Ock photograph, we photograph the world, Ock in the colors of nature, Detroit Photographic Company, Scenic and Art Publishers." I made a trade. I'll show you what I traded for these two. Okay, then we're jumping again to the 60,000 series. And the majority of these are black and white or sepia of ordinary people. That's the first 100. And then they go to art reproductions in sepia and color. So as you see, here's the Mona Lisa. There's no information on the front. Here's the back. And it shows the number of the card and the Foston Detroit Publishing Company, but it's by Leonardo da Vinci of the Mona Lisa. Then this one here has the Foston information here by John W. Alexander, and it's called Sunlight. This one's also in color. If you could see that her flower there is in red, her dress is blue. The number for that card is down here at the bottom. So now we're jumping yet another 10,000 to the 70,000 series. Some of these were 3 to 5 part panoramics. And then it wasn't like using a regular camera, a newer camera or your phone's camera where you just move it across. They would have multiple plates for each one, and they would set it up so that they tracked across. And when I was working on my thesis, it was hard to align them. Now the 71,000 series, very similar to the 70,000, but some cards have D for Detroit on them, and that's because they tended to be contract cards at this point in time. And so the ones that they were selling were, they'd put the D on. And what they did add is the year it was printed in Roman numerals just for the years, not for the 20th century or the 1900. at the base of the dividing line for the back. And so it's right here, XVII equals 1917. And then the 72,000 series was really started at the decline of the company. And at that point in time, they were really concentrating on the contract series. And then for the Fred Harvey's was another contract series. So these are some of the images from the Fred Harvey group. And so those were 79, 80, 81, and 82,000 series, as well as the contract series. And these here were Fred Harvey's. And these are contract series pictures. And I just want to point this one out here, that this area in Del Mar and the beach cities north of it, the hillsides, cliff sides are very fragile. And across here through Del Mar, there's a train that runs across the cliffs that they've had to shut down many times to make sure that tracks won't break off. And when you figure this was over 100 years ago, that's a long time. But in these towns, you know, it may have started out at first, and in some cases, the first number of the street is fourth. This place, the hotel burnt down in the 60s. There's now a very fancy hotel there. And I'm going to go back a second. And these kind of wilderness areas, they're gone. They are now houses. And so Fred Harvey, who was he? Well, he came from Scotland. He started working for the railroads. And as the trains moved further west, he noticed that there wasn't any good places to eat, or the service was poor, or the lodgings were difficult to find. And so he opened up his first Harvey House restaurant in 1871. First, he hired men and found them to be surly and gruff. And so he decided to try to hire young women based on their appearance and moral character. He trained them, he gave them room and board, good wages, and you know, that's kind of hourly wages now at 1750, but back then it was a good salary for a month. They also received tips, and they were also given uniforms. And so they really had nothing to buy, but so they could almost live for a month just on their tips. And Harvey also saw the need for quality when he took over the railroad station newsstands, and he wanted the best quality to sell at the newsstands. So he contracted with Detroit to sell Fostent cards under the Fred Harvey name. And so they were primarily the 5,000 series, which we already know had expanded over years. And many of the cards were from earlier Detroit series, and they say H dash. And this card is a map of both the Santa Fe railroad lines, but also where through here there are his restaurants and hotels were located. And they go down to the Gulf of Mexico, they go down to El Paso. But as I was looking at this map while setting this up, I realized the song Route 66 by Nat King Cole came to mind because it goes from Chicago to LA, but it also goes to San Francisco. I think you'd have to transfer in Barstow to get to LA. And I had mentioned earlier about Little Fostent Journeys. They had 50 sets of 40 cards each, selected to best represent the topic in the title. Colorado did not receive the Little Fostent Journey book, and this photograph was from the Library of Congress, as was this. They were initially as books, so it's kind of like a library would have them, parents would buy them for their children, kind of like the popularity of an encyclopedia in the 50s and 60s, that it's going to help their kids do better in school. And so this is what they initially looked like. Mine is a plain gray box. Here's samples of the cards inside mine, the train across the desert, the oxen cart. It really is a nice representation, and there are multiple different 49 other card sets. The last card, this is a special collection, private contract series, but not really. And this is the Samuel Schmucker group. And they're probably the highest priced of any of the Detroits. For example, this card here, and this is what I traded, one of these and one other, for the photochrome cards. This one here, last Christmas time, I saw one in not as good shape. There were holes in it, the edges were gnawed. So either a silverfish or a mouse had been eating away at it for $75. So these other cards I know go for even more. You know, there are sets you can get. They're about the highest of the group. And here are not my references, but what I used for reference and online resources. Time Exposure, which is a reprint of his original book. And everyone who collects Detroit's knows about Nancy's book. This one here, Birth of a Century, is really one, if you find one, buy it. It's primarily there is text, but it's by Jim Hughes. It's primarily the photochromes. These two are not biographies, but they're about Jackson and his photography, and then the book by the Davises about Schmucker's images. And I want to thank you. If you want to contact me, you can, after this, you could send it to me that way. And also my other email is goodwinrosanne@iCloud. But I'm going to go back here. I went through and made sure that all the links worked, so they're all updated as of this week. So it includes Yale University. I prefer the Library of Congress. Then there's because that one, all you do, if you want to just see the photochromes, you just type in there photochrome. If you want to find out more about the company, you type in Detroit Publishing Company, and that's how and they're all together. There's also New York Public Library collections, and that site I'm not as fond of because they just kind of, there's just one row that you have to just kind of scroll through, but also the link to the National Park Service's Scotts Bluff site. And thank you. And now for questions.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Well, thank you, Michael.
Anybody have questions?
Yes, I was wondering when they doctored the photographs, how did they do that? Because I know that some of the albumin prints I've seen, British albumin prints, they were able to do that. I've never been sure what the process was, like to move that child from the side of the picture to the center of the picture.
I'm trying to remember, but it wasn't readily available to know about. Come on, you worked at George Eastman House.
I never heard it explained. I mean, I remember seeing when they did a show, the British Masters of the Albumin print, how they put photographs together, but I've never seen it. Maybe David Freund would know, but how they would move stuff around and make it look like an actual image. Stuff didn't look cut out like these pictures you showed us. The stuff didn't look cut out.
No.
Pasted on.
But when you figure there was all the color change and things like that, that's pretty much the same thing. You know, it was.
I don't know what that was.
Yeah. Give me a moment and I'll get back to you, Rick.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, come on, I thought that you guys would be ready to ask questions.
Well, I have some questions I can ask you. No.
Okay. Do they pertain to this or they
Oh,
just...
they pertain to Detroit company. I no
Okay.
longer have the evidence, but they did, I noticed you didn't really show any of these cards of the native people or even the black folks. They they put out a whole bunch of cards that it would show them blacks in very stereotypic ways of the early
Oh, the
20.
Black Americana stuff.
Yeah, the Black Americana. I had a bunch of cards once, and I had a fairly substantial collection, but I divested of a good chunk of my collection, and the black cards were among those that I had ended up selling off, and it ended up in the hands of a person who collected Black Americana. So it actually worked out well because somebody was very happy to get those cards. I always remember a Watermelon Jake, and there's one of them that was fairly, that I remember that one. There was like a, it was a mommy and pickaninnies going to the market, and just examples of that kind of stereotype of wouldn't be politically correct or you wouldn't dare do in this day and age. I don't know if you
Well,
ever.
actually, what's occurred in this day and age is that a lot of blacks have decided they're collecting that stuff.
Oh yes, I know that.
And so thus they're quite popular too, and their value is higher than many other groups.
I got a good price of them, and it did end up in the hands of a black man.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Which is probably who would buy it.
yeah, he bought them. He bought them from he and I were friends with a dealer, and they sort of went from my hands and the dealer's hands to his hands.
Mm-hmm.
But it was actually it worked out good for us. Then I was going to show you something. Have you ever seen this?
All right, it should be over. They're doing questions and answers.
Yes.
Should be over soon.
This is not really, this is sort of like a full, sort of a souvenir packet.
Right, that's the other thing, and I realized I didn't put those in with the little Boston journeys because, and they're like cards, sets of 10 or so cards, and they also have them for the Fred Harvey pictures.
Mm-hmm.
But the missions, actually, I don't have one in that, but I have all the missions separately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question. Particularly when I think of the black ones, which is a subject I was going to raise, naturally, given the photographers, Jackson and others, the weight of the cards tends to be in the West. But there were still, like the black subjects, not necessarily geographically centered. Do we know who did those or any photographs that weren't centered in Western subject matter?
I don't really understand your question. So
Who did the black cards? Who was the
that I'm
photographer?
unfamiliar with, but you could probably go on the Library of Congress site and you keep opening up the information and it will say on there. It should. But the thing is, when you say of the West, that's where you confuse me because those things, that wasn't part of the West.
That's what I said. Most of the cards are in the West, and the ones that weren't in the West, I was curious about who might have made them.
Oh, they were made for the whole country. I mean,
who made them?
I concentrated on the West because that's where I am, and that's where I did my research for my thesis. But just like in reality, that 1/3 of the East, of the country in the East, is where 2/3 of the population is. So there were a lot, and that's where if you go on the Library of Congress site, you'll have the opportunity to see the depth of the material for the company is really in the East.
Right.
And so I don't know who was the photographer at all. I'm going to just say that it was probably multiple and even possibly Jackson, who thought that was horrible from what his autobiography states. So, because he was proud to be fighting during the Civil War for the country and for Lincoln. So I can't tell you that, but if you go on the Library of Congress site, you probably could find out more for those.
Were those mission cards from California, were they published by Detroit?
Yes.
Mhm.
What was the deal with the proof page you showed at the beginning of the presentation, Roseanne? That was really cool.
Isn't it? That's possibly why I showed it to you. And because it was so beautiful, but you could see that it wasn't all the same image, which is how I would have imagined it would have been. It was
Hmm.
probably an order had come up and they were just printing out that order. I don't understand the reasoning for it.
Would
Is that
those have been
something-
printed at the same stage of the printing process, maybe?
Yeah.
It's sort of like the dye transfer. It's one color ink. And then they could examine that, this check registration and all.
No, I think that it was more, as I was researching and I went back and, I researched again over the last month. And so I have to say, I'm going to be happy that the program today is over. So I can move on to researching for Hales group for their February meeting. They were able to, should they want to, have them use those stones in a press if they wanted to. So it was more likely that they put them together, just print them that way.
Okay.
But again, I'm going to have to get back to you on that.
To David's point, I'm not sure that this fits in, but there were cities on the East Coast that have Detroit publishing. I particularly know New York City had Detroit cards, and they're lovely. We haven't really talked about the color, etc., but they're just so eye-catching. And if it's a New York card, then I'm hot for that and want to share it with my customers. So David, if you're looking for states that had Detroit publishing on the East Coast, I can look at what I have and let you know.
Well,
But they also had, in Massachusetts and, and so a lot of the cards for, and in DC and in Massachusetts which is what I was going to say, is that there were a lot of the contract cards for the schools, for, places like,
Also Seven Gables.
Yes.
yeah, House of Seven Gables. Thank you, Michael. So there were a lot of different places that had, Chautauqua in upstate New York, or Niagara Falls, and a lot of the various Adirondack and places in New York.
Berkshires,
Pardon?
the Berkshires.
Yeah, yeah. So there were, Cornell had hired them. So there was a lot of business in the East Coast. The difference being is that as far as tourism, and as the trains moved west, but the amount of tourism to the west was very high, and especially during those big years of postcards.
Well, tourism was quite prominent in the East. There's
Yeah.
there's gobs of Adirondacks and Lake George and Niagara Falls. I think they were just part of the original run when postcards were flying off the shelves. As you said later on, they concentrated on these special contracts. Cornell Cooperative Society in the Chautauqua bookstore among two of the sets that I have retained because they're located in areas that I have familiarity. And I know in Vermont, I've got my hands on a number of cards that show the maple sugaring of the time period. So you can find some very good, lots of good East Coast, particularly upstate, Northeast, and I think White Mountains are heavily covered.
Yeah, they are.
If you wanted to collect those, I think Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and some other and even Cleveland, the city of Detroit has some really fabulous cards, and well up into the Upper Peninsula, Mackinac Island. It's and even some for Grand Rapids, Michigan, of all close to home.
Well, with Michigan, they're based in Detroit, so that
Yeah.
makes sense to have a lot of
And I've-
Michigan cards.
I've acquired many of the Ann Arbor, and they did a real large panoramic of Ann Arbor showing the university campus. It's probably about 5-6 cards long. And they also did for Ann Arbor. I don't know if you're there's a speculation in the very early years, there are a few cards done with no imprint on them. And they attribute an early view of the medical building on the University of Michigan campus as having been done by Detroit Photochrome. It's a very rare card. It has that vignette style.
Oh, wow.
They also did the Olmsted Parks here in Rochester, New York.
So the thing is, there's cards for pretty much everywhere, but because they started with Jackson's collection, of his photographs, of which there were thousands, we think more of that being of the West rather than of the East. But there are, images from everywhere. And then Jackson also went to Cuba and Puerto Rico, Cuba during their war. So I know I have a good collection of Cuba pictures because I had gone there and then became fascinated with it. So there's a lot of ways that, and I don't think I mentioned that they also did Mexico, and it was for the photos of Mexico. Again, it was mainly Jackson who went down there. And he had gone pretty much all over the world. He supposedly joined the Detroit company when he had, because he was spending so much time away from home and wanted to kind of settle down.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Roseanne.
It was great.
Thank
Really
you.
good.